when you add the word strategic to design, it's in a way to say that you are maybe even more focused on the value creation and the impact of an organization, and at a maybe more long-term and more wide level than if you are, you could say, a product designer or a service designer, and you are working more on a discrete individual services or product, right? And so given that what we're looking at is not more business as usual, and it's not just churning out more products because the world actually doesn't need more products, it needs new systems for circularity, for example, or it's not just churning out more services because people don't need just to be delighted, they need to be perhaps educated and helped in shifting behavior towards more sustainable behaviors. Well, then the emphasis needs to be on strategic design, because those are the ones that work on the cross-cutting, long-term, cross-level systemic issues.
Designing the future is essential for shaping the world we want to live in. That's why it's more crucial than ever to be strategic about it, think long-term, and embrace complexity rather than avoid it. The field of strategic design is growing, and as two strategic designers, we want to explore how it's changing the way we design products, buildings, organizations, and landscapes. In this podcast, we'll interview strategic designers and professionals in the field, hoping to enlighten both ourselves and others about the future of designing with a strategic mindset and skill set. We're Emily and Isaac, both strategic designers with different backgrounds. Isaac is an industrial designer from Finland, and Emily has a business background in design culture and economics from Denmark. Join us for today's conversation with our guest, who will be unfolding strategic design. Welcome to today's episode of Unfolding Strategic Design. Today we are joined by Christian Bason, co-founder of Transition Collective, an organization that combines strategy, design, innovation, systems thinking, foresight, sustainability, and transition research with the extensive professional experience of Christian and his co-founder Sune Knudsen. Christian is also an adjunct professor at the University of Technology Sydney and a leader in residence at Copenhagen Business School. His educational background includes a master's in political science and government from Aarhus University and executive educations in leadership, change, and risk management from Harvard Business School, NYU, and the Wharton School in the US. He also holds a PhD in design leadership from Copenhagen Business School. From 2014 to 2023, Christian served as the CEO of the Danish Design Centre, which is the National Centre for Design. Previous to his experience as the CEO of DDC, Christian led Mindlab, the Danish government's innovation team. He's the author of 9 books on design, public sector innovation, and leadership. So, Christian, with that being said, and the extensive introduction of your previous experience and your current experience, welcome to our podcast. Thank you so much for joining us.
You're welcome. Thank you so much for having me. And I really apologize for the long CV. It's just something that happens when you grow older. So I need to work on a shorter version, I think.
Yeah, but it's also great to see all the nuances because you have moved around, and I think it's quite relevant for where you are today too. So we would like for you to start by giving a short and brief introduction of yourself and who you are and what you do for a living to our listeners.
Yeah, so I think, of course, the bio sums it up pretty much in the sense that of my professional career. You might add that I've always had this very big interest in the social sciences, and after studying political science, I actually started out the first about 10 years of my career, first as a student intern, and then as an adult colleague, and quickly also as a manager in a company called Rumble Management Consulting, as it is today, and where I was sort of doing quite traditional, you could say, advisory and research services around evaluation and analysis for government clients. So that's, you could say, the formative years of my own career. And in many ways, the first job you have is quite significant for how you look at leadership, how you look at what is a good organization. It also creates friendships and relationships that I still have today. So that's maybe a part of my CV that's also significant. And then, of course, also remembering that I have a life outside work. I'm a father of 3, including one child who has a developmental disability. So I have that challenge close in our family. He's 21 now and still part of the family, lives at home, still married and living here in Copenhagen and trying to also enjoy all the things that opportunities that Copenhagen offers and the surroundings here. And of course, being able to travel and experience the world. But yeah, it's good to join you, and I really look forward to our conversation.
Thank you so much. And thank you for a great introduction, also including the private aspects of your life, which is just as important as the professional ones. So you have an educational background in political science and government. Why did you choose this path back in the days?
So in high school, I became increasingly interested in world affairs, and remember sitting at our kitchen table in Silkeborg here in Denmark and discussing politics especially with both my mom and dad. My father is from the United States, and moving from one country to another that he chose to do in the 1960s is probably also something that is a reflection of being aware of world affairs. When my father immigrated to Denmark, the Vietnam War was happening, and he was actually also in the U.S. Army and finished his army work while actually also moving to Europe. And my mother is a social science, both graduate but also teacher. And I remember these sort of formative years as a teenager to be quite engaged with political affairs and discussing at the kitchen table and at the dinner table. And at the time when I graduated from high school, we had the fall of the Berlin Wall, the opening up of the Eastern Bloc. It was quite formative for me as well. My family has friends in Eastern Germany, for example. I visited DDR in the 1980s, so before the wall came down. Not that many people remember that, perhaps. And also, I remember very much the Gulf War, which took place just around the time when I also started studying political science. And I think that was formative in the sense of being interested in world affairs. So that was actually quite a big part of my background. And I must also say that when I now reflect back, there's a huge impression and impact in my life and career from design. But you can't really escape the foundational outlook, which to me has been about the bigger questions of society. And that's also why, of course, I studied political science.
And then after your studies, you started working as the business director at Rambøll, right? Or the business manager, yes. And then you started working for the government in the Mindlab innovation.
Yeah, in the innovation team. And the story goes that when I was at Rambøll, the consultancy, I got more and more interested in public sector innovation as a phenomenon, which was not very well described at the time. I think if you look at the literature or research or articles or books from the early 2000s, you find very little. I mean, you find some, but not so much. And so I actually started a project within the consultancy to look at how do governments innovate, and did some research, and we published, it was actually sort of a self-funded publication we produced in that space. And then parallel to that, the Danish government's internal innovation team, which at the time was only part of the Ministry of Business, was looking for a new director. And it so happened that I was invited to apply, and at the time, because I'd done the research, which was very fresh and very new, and some of the first, not the first, but some of the first in the Danish context, I remember feeling, that job was like, it was a match made in heaven, in a sense that it matched exactly what I was interested in and what I was doing. And even when I started the job, I already had a book contract to write a book called Innovating Welfare, which was published by a Danish publisher just in that spring of 2007. So all the stars were kind of aligned, and it felt just as the right thing for me to do, even though it was a bit difficult leaving my first job, which has been so formative, and I've been involved with the company since 1995, and this was then 2007. So it was quite a big jump for me to go also from the private sector into government.
And how did that switch feel like at the moment? Was it something like that you always wanted to do, or did it by somehow also come by surprise?
It probably came a little bit of a surprise because I'd maybe not been very clear of what a government job might look like, and I was very happy with being in the consultancy. It should also be said that when I graduated from university, my specialty or my master's degree was actually in international relations. In fact, it was exploring the relationship after the end of the Cold War between Europe and the United States, which is now turning out to be quite relevant. In fact, I need to reread it and see what I was suggesting about European and US relationships. I don't think I could have imagined what's happening now. But I did have the feeling that I wanted to go into foreign affairs and government that way. But it so happened that the consultancy actually offered quite a lot of travel and work with the European Union. And so I found myself in the private sector, but doing very interesting work on policy and strategic evaluations with government. And so what triggered the change to Mindlab and moving into the public sector was exactly that it was a chance to work on government innovation from inside government, something that was quite novel at the time, and it felt like a huge opportunity. And that was also the way that my new boss, my director within the ministry, sold it to me. She was like, "This is your chance to really make a difference if you take on this position." As you can imagine, it didn't pay more than my previous job, moving from private to public, but there were other really interesting elements that convinced me. And I remember the feeling after the first few months where we're starting to really reimagine and rebuild Mindlab, that one big difference between the public sector and the private sector is that in the public sector, the question is, how do we spend the money in the best possible way? Whereas in the private sector, the question is, how do we make the money? How do we earn the money? So it was a big paradigm shift actually for me. And now, of course, I'm back in the private sector. So now I'm back to asking, where does the money come from? But it was really, really good. And I also felt that it was the right thing to do at the time when I made the change. I had already for a few years been thinking I shouldn't stay forever, in the consultancy. It was time to move. And in 6, 7, 8 years, that's probably plenty of time within one single organization. And that's also been the case from when I left Mindlab and the case from when I left the Danish Design Centre, that these 8, even 9 years, that's becoming enough in terms of how much value can you add, how much can you keep learning. There's a pretty big risk of getting bored if you stay too long. So I was probably ready to move in any case.
Yeah. And then after being a part of the Mindlab team, you then became the CEO of Danish Design Centre. How come you moved into the design industry?
Yeah, and that is a little bit strange perhaps, but the story, of course, is that during my tenure at the Mindlab for 8 years, I pretty quickly realized there was something with design we needed, especially for working with our mandate, which was a citizen-centered and enterprise-centered innovation. So placing end users at the heart of how governments imagine ideas and develop policies and services. And it took me the first few months to realize that there was such a space as service design. You could call it strategic design, human-centered design. Design thinking was also coming into play at that time in a bigger way. And so we had to explore what that could do for the team. And in the first recruitment of the team for Mindlab, which I had the fortune of being able to recruit all of them except for one person, and that person was Sune Knudsen, who's now my colleague again. He was there already when I came in to Mindlab. But then we had a whole new strategy, a whole new partnership, and a whole new set of colleagues. And when we recruited in the spring of 2007, we took great pains to look for designers. And we, at the time, I think, hired at least 2 trained designers, one with a digital and IT design background from the IT university, and one with a industrial and product design background from the academy. So we made sure that in the small team we were only about 6 people in the start, 6, 7 people, but we made sure to get designers on board from the start. And that became the beginning of my sort of understanding of the field. And pretty quickly I realized how different it was from management, political science, business studies, but how important it was for creativity, for user-centeredness, for research, for innovation, and also in terms of methodologies for structuring an innovation process. So it didn't take me that long to start writing books about it. And within 3 years, I actually started my PhD on design and government.
When you say that you collected the team, what kind of qualifications did you search for? Not only the background, but more of like personal qualifications.
I think it's relevant, a really, really relevant question you ask, Isaac, because honestly, when we look today at where design gets embedded strategically, truly impactfully in organizations, and also where advisors, externals are able to really work with some of the most complex and strategic challenges of organizations, it's still quite rare that designers get into the substance of things and are not mainly working on the visuals and on the brand and communications and perhaps the intricacies of digital design. But I honestly do think that we were able to, also with the vantage point, of course, inside the organization and organizations we were part of, to impact practices more and impact also the outcomes in terms of what more than the policies or the service designs or whatever came out of our work. And one big reason, I think, is that transdisciplinarity that we built into the team from the start. So we had a very clear picture of what we were recruiting for. And basically, we recruited for 3 things. One was someone who understood government and could work within the public sector, understood the dynamics of being in the public sector. So that could be for political science. It could be people with a track record inside government. So I was very fortunate to hire, for example, Kit Lykketoft, who was there also as a deputy director for a long time, who had a background from the Ministry of Employment and a very sound understanding of the mechanisms of government. That was number one, right? So you had to understand the business or the organization and the dynamics of the sector you're in. The second one was the research side and the deep anthropological and ethnographic competencies that it takes to really understand user needs and work with that kind of qualitative, grounded research in a very structured, systematic, and professional way. So we hired for anthropologists and sociologists and other with a very qualitative social science background. And then thirdly, then of course the designers that we were fortunate to recruit. One important aspect was also that many of the recruits actually were multidisciplinary already. So one had degrees both in arts and cultural and communications on the one side and industrial design on the other side. One had a degree with digital design plus sociology. One had a degree of anthropology and history. So we had these people, a team which was already minded for cross-disciplinary work, which is important, of course, if you want to create a team where people are truly T-shaped and have both deep expertise, but can also easily connect with others. And then we also recruited, and this is maybe also a little bit important, we recruited for people that were very high on talent, but also very low as low as possible on ego. I would say not everybody was low on ego, but people who were very, very nice, who were very pleasant, who were very easygoing and had a quite high social IQ. And the reason we needed very high social IQ is that when you have that very fragile role of being in the innovation lab and you're sitting in a bit on the side of organizations and you are dependent on stakeholder relationships and connecting with people and building trust and relationships to do your work, then you have to also be very people-minded. And that also meant that we really recruited a team that was very, very pleasant and easy to work with. And I remember we had an occupational psychologist, like a recruitment expert who tested everybody. And at one point he said to me, he'd never recruited a team where people were so likable. And so the likability factor had to be pretty high. And truly it was. Again, everybody has their own quirks and things, and so do I. But it was a really, really competent and also very likable team.
It sounds like a group of people that is very, niche in a way. I would assume it's not that often that you find a group of people that checks all these boxes, right?
It's not very often, and I rarely see it. And it's also an incredible luxury to be able to recruit an entire team in one go. Of course, more people were added over the years. Both we expanded the team with more people, and we also recruited PhD students who did industrial PhDs within Mindlab. But it was really, really very formative and very important. And I'm still in contact with many of them to this day and have worked with many of them in other contexts as well, and still am to this day. It was really unique in that way. And it was niche in the sense of both the combination of skills, but also that we were lucky to be able to really recruit some extremely competent people. We put up a job ad for the recruitment, which said, "Do you want to revolutionize the public sector from within?" And we received, hundreds and hundreds of applications where many of them said, "This speaks to me. This is my dream job. This is exactly what I want to do." Of course, we also got the mandatory people who were just sending off applications because they had to, but we got, let's say 100 or 120 that were very good. And so, of course, we were able to find the best talent. And that, again, that was just a incredible luxury. And actually, this happened in 2007, where the Danish economy was it was burning very, very high. It was just before the financial crisis. So things were very tough in terms of finding talent because the labor market was red hot. So we were in many ways super privileged, and I'm really grateful to that because, of course, the quality of the team was important for quality of the work.
Yeah, which is also interesting that it kind of indicates that there is this will to actually change government from the inside. It shows something just based on the amount of applications that it got.
It really does. I think also we were fortunate is that we could also offer an environment that was conducive to talented and creative people that wanted to work on difficult problems, where I've seen over the years a lot of challenges for designers, especially designers or other, you could say, if we choose to call them creatives, who find themselves in structures and cultures organizationally that are really hard to be in if you are on your own. So you could say that we were also able to create because we had the physical space of Mindlab, we had the whole team. We could build strategy together. We could build tools together. We could build cases together. We could start recruiting more colleagues together. That it was a conducive environment for people where, in other cases, some of the colleagues would have had a really hard time being part of a traditional bureaucracy and trying to do that kind of work.
You take on some of the same recruitment principles to Danish Design Centre. Were you looking for the same combination of people, or how did you go about that?
That's a really good question. I mean, of course, the Danish Design Centre is and was a large organization, and it also had its staff of 12 or 15 people when I arrived as a new CEO. But there's no doubt that the mandate I arrived with was what's in the management lingo is called a turnaround. And it turned out that the competencies and skills and attitudes of the current team didn't really match where the mandate was and also where I believed we should go. So we did change quite a lot at the Danish Design Centre, and over the years, we recruited what is basically a new team. And the new team was maybe not as narrow focused and as methodologically focused as the Mindlab team. It was broader because the mandate of the Danish Design Centre is broader and there are different skills that are needed. So for example, we had much more focus on communication, especially over the years with people with a comms background and strategic communication. We had people with a more of a private sector background from the business side, which is important because Danish Design Centre focuses quite a lot on small and medium-sized enterprise and business. And we also had people with a bit of a more technology background who had a sort of a very focus on sort of, you could say, digital innovation, for example. So I would say that the DDC team was somewhat broader, and but still, of course, there was intention behind the profiles, and we also did in our communications, we sort of shared what are the key skills that we represent. But to me, what was maybe the most important part of recruitment for the Danish Design Centre when I came in was to actually recruit designers for the Design Centre, because there weren't really any, at least not any strategic designers at the time. And I couldn't imagine how you can be a design center without having the very skill and competency you talk about internally as well, and practicing what you preach, right? So we would have to practice strategic and human-centered design methods as a center at the same time as we were advocating that kind of work for others. And honestly, that was not the case when I arrived. In fact, they were relying on external consultants for almost all of design work, of which there wasn't very much anyway. So it was a big change, for sure.
Was it difficult to find strategic designers at that time?
I think it's actually always difficult to find good strategic designers, simply because, and that's also why, by the way, I just think that the design and entrepreneurship, strategic design entrepreneurship education and the partnership between CBS and the Royal Academy is so important, because that is the chance to really build a cohort of and really a talent around strategic design coming from those two different sort of angles. So I think it is hard, and often you would find that people who are very good in strategic design are self-trained. And many do not have a formal design background, but have more of a social science background, for example, coming out of anthropology, for example. So I think it is it's changed probably since then, because this recruitment was 10 years ago in the DDC, and soon 20 years ago in Mindlab, so it's a long time ago. And I'm still not convinced to this day that organizations, for example, consultancies that are offering very business-oriented, very sort of systems change, strategic, or could also be policy-oriented strategic design, that they have a very large market. It isn't as large a market or as large a chance as I think it should be. But of course, it's much bigger today than it was 20 years ago.
Yeah, because one thing that we also discuss in the episodes is that strategic designers do fit into these organizations that you just mentioned, who operates in a market where they're trying to change current systems and procedures and businesses. But we also discuss how strategic designers do also sort of play a role both internally to strategy development, where they do incorporate other elements than a typical manager would do, right? Because strategic designers do couple sort of the visionary, the sort of aspirational perspective to the very feasible one, with various backgrounds in that, because you can both come from a design background, but also from a business or a social science background.
Yeah. No, I agree. And I think that insistence on being more visionary, more transformative, more ambitious when it comes to change is sort of an attitude that designers come in with. GT designers also come in with an attitude that has a higher tolerance for ambiguity and open-endedness, which is often needed, especially at this time in the world, in good strategy processes and innovation processes. And then I think there's also, and that of course maybe is a more of a trait of folks who have a formal education in design, is the insistence on being concrete, giving shape and form to abstract visions, or to being insisting on being situational. So asking questions about who, where, and when, and transforming visions into something that's more tangible. So I think there are all those different questions that strategic designers do ask. and often also with, you could say maybe with more traditional graphic designers or visual designers can really create a lot of value in strategy processes. I do think that there is the paradigm or the paradox that strategic design, in a sense, needs to be in the C-suite or in the boardroom or in the strategic functions. But just because strategic design is there doesn't mean that the strategic designer is there. So there's a bit of a challenge that business folks have now understood at least some of the core elements through design thinking, and they can understand how to demand or recruit for it. But that doesn't necessarily mean that you embed people within strategy teams that have that background, and that's the problem or the challenge, I think.
Yeah, it's very much an external capacity that consults.
Yeah, and when it becomes external, it doesn't have the impact on the thinking and on the questions and on the fundamental core of the work as if it's internal. You simply don't have the access, and I see that myself now. I mean, I think my colleague Soon and I are doing a lot of super interesting and relevant work, but we're coming in always as the outsiders, right? And you're not part of the everyday talk over the coffee or over lunch in the organization, and you don't have the same sense of what's at stake. And you also don't have the access to the stakeholders internally in the same way you do have if you're internal. I think in many ways that's of course the benefit of labs and internal teams that they can fluidly move around the halls, whereas you are external as an advisor and you are also given access as such.
Can that also, on the contrary, open up possibilities if you are external, that you
For sure
not get blind by the everyday life?
No, I think it opens up many possibilities, and I think if externals, advisors, are doing their jobs well, then it can be a hugely impactful and great thing for organizations because they bring in new inspiration and new knowledge. They can cross-pollinate between different organizations. My own experiences also in bringing in international knowledge through my international network. It can also, externals can sometimes better challenge assumptions because they don't have as much at stake. Most they can lose is the project, then they can just move on. Where if you might have a lot at stake if you are speaking truth to power internally in the organization in terms of your future career and future relationships. So you can also, if you are bold enough as an advisor, as an external, you can also speak truth more. Of course, many advisors don't because they are afraid of losing the work, and they'd rather just be friendly and then go along, and then they might get more work. So I think there's an ethic in it being a good advisor that is really important. And having spent my first 10 years as an advisor and now being it again in at least part of my time, it's something at least I think a lot about. I don't know whether I practice it well enough, but being a sparring partner and somebody who can also say to a CEO, for example, hey, this is not the way you should go, or you should rethink this or whatever, right? So I think there's some benefit for sure. And I think both are needed. I should also mention that at Mindlab, we did partner with quite a few external design agencies, service design teams on our work. Both to extend our resources, but also to bring in that new insights and new types of methods and so on. And of course, at the Danish Design Centre, we made a big part of our work was to build new opportunities and markets for the advisory side of the design space. So for consultancies of all kinds in design, that's of course a big part of the DDC's role.
Yeah, and let's also now then move on to your newest, what should we call it, adventure, Transition Collective, that you founded. I think it's 1.5 years ago or so with Sune, right? Why did you start a Transition Collective together?
Well, I think we started it firstly because of the need we saw that the world does scream for more long-term, more ambitious, more impactful change that points towards a more sustainable world. And that's in fact also how we worked with the Danish Design Centre and pivoted the center during our period as directors towards impact and missions and systems change. But there are always some constraints in an organization like the DDC. For example, the constraint that most of the work needs to focus on the private sector and on business growth, or constraints in terms of your stakeholder relations with the government. And that goes with the job, and that's fine for the time it takes. But when our tenure and my own contract ended anyway, then I felt that the time was to say, okay, how can one take everything we've learned, everything I've learned through my career, my entire career, everything that Sune has learned through his entire career, and bring it into play, into practice with organizations that need it. And we are in a world where a lot of organizations need a different kind of thinking and working with innovation and change. And that cuts across all sectors and areas. So having the freedom to work with international organizations, work with government, work with cities, work with the private sector, work even with startups. That openness and freedom to bring everything you've learned and bring that to good people who also see the need for change, but maybe don't know how. Or maybe they need skills, resources, tools to do it. Maybe they need that bit push. Maybe they need some truth. So that's why we started Transition Collective, to say we are a small collective, but we think that we can also, join other collectives to do bigger things. And we think that transitions are probably maybe that's the next term we need to embrace. So just like 20 years ago, innovation and even user-centered innovation was like the term. Then in Danish, omstilling, or in English, transition towards a different society is really what we need. And in fact, if you look at the world that is really chaotic these days, then it feels like we're in the middle of a turbulent period. And we talk about in transition science, right, of the turbulent transition between what is and what's to come. And it's natural that the old systems are struggling and they are fighting back. And they are, as we see in the United States, for example, very much fighting back in terms of trying to move society on climate change or on diversity, on knowledge and science, whatever it is, move it back to, I don't know, pre-industrial times almost. And it's part of where the world is now. And for us, it feels incredibly important to point to the future and look to the future with our partners and ask, like, how can we create something that's better for people and better for planet and more sustainable?
Why do you believe that there is a pushback at the moment globally when we are starting to look back?
I think it is that struggle between you could say reactionary or conservative forces and progressive forces, and also maybe that some of the progressive forces went almost overboard or too far sometimes, and it got a little bit weird and created some anger and some frustrations or feelings of loss, feelings of not being part of the future, and not understanding what's the new language, what are the new words, what is this whole sustainability thing, what is the whole diversity thing, and so that's a struggle, which in a way I feel is unnecessary, because I think all of humankind can agree we want to live in peace, we want to live in balance with each other, in balance with nature, we want to live in a flourishing society where we don't take more than the planet can support. But there is, of course, struggles around interests and resources and worldviews and ideologies that are in a way coming in that are putting up barriers for this change. And in my mind, I normally say that of the United Nations global goals, there are 17 of them. And they are in many ways right now, in big crisis and backtracking on many of the global goals. But there is one goal that has been underestimated massively, and we never talk about really. And it's goal number 17, which is called Partnership for the Goals. And that is like the goal, or I could sometimes call it the ring to rule them all, like in Lord of the Rings. The goal to rule them all is number 17, because number 17 basically says, how do we collaborate? How do we organize? How do we partner? And we are just not good enough at that yet. We are simply not good enough at partnering and organizing and collaborating for long-term big shifts and transitions like the global goals are calling for. And that underinvestment in capacity and skills and knowledge for strategic collaboration for long-term transitions, that's in many ways, I think, the main reason for the crisis. The reason for the crisis is that we are not leveraging our collective creativity and imagination in ways that we can. And speaking to you as strategic designers, you know exactly what I'm talking about. But for a lot of organizations and people also in power positions, they might intuitively understand it, but they don't know how to do it. So that call, that urgency is in many ways what's driving Sune and me and our collaborators in our work. And there was a long list you were reading, Emilie, on what we say we do, but that's of course also a combined 40 years of experience in work life, where we are saying this is what we've learned. We think all these elements and skills and domains are needed, and we think we can curate them to help organizations achieve their goals.
What kind of projects do you then facilitate or are you part of and consult? Because is it very national? Is it more global, EU-based, or even more international? In what level of the organizations do you also advise?
How long do we have?
The whole day?
Just because there's been quite a bit. And some things are small, some things are big. But, well, in terms of levels, we worked with everything from the United Nations, like the UNDP and other large agencies on innovation, scaling innovation, missions, portfolios. So that's one space. European Union, we mostly train and teach these days, but connect with them. At national level, we have to do some work with Danish ministries, quite a lot of work with Danish philanthropic foundations that have discovered systems change and strategic innovation, and not least mission-oriented innovation as a way they want to go. Wicked problems is a big discussion with the philanthropies. We then also work with Danish regions on also quite a lot of missions and innovation. And we work with local government on organizational design and setting organizations free. There's a whole frisættelse reform going on in different parts of the Danish welfare state. So we work with local governments. So those are all the levels you can imagine really on the public sector side, both nationally and internationally. And then we do work with both philanthropy quite a bit, but also with private firms that are focused on longer term systemic change. So that's the big focus of my residency with Copenhagen Business School, which is more of a research position, or it might become a research position. Right now, it's more of a exploring and residency to find out what might be the field, but we call it ecosystem leadership, which is basically how private firms enter into large complex transitions where new markets are being shaped or should be shaped, and where they balance profits and economic viability with environmental and societal impact in ambitious ways. So I mean, it's been quite a bit. We have some of the cases on our website. We have a very small and simple website to just share what we're doing and share articles and talks and so on. But it's and the more I think about it, the more I realize that because Sune and I collectively have had experience both in very traditional sort of private for-profit firms, in the consulting business especially, we have experience with private firms from DDC quite extensively. We then have worked with civic society and foundations. Danish Design Centre is a foundation, and we've both worked extensively inside government. That there aren't that many people also in the roles we play that can move fluidly between those domains. And including, by the way, universities, where I've spent quite a lot of time, both in my doctoral research, but also advising and working with universities, which are actually also partners of ours. So we collaborate with some large universities as well in different roles to work with innovation and leadership and culture and so on. So we're keeping ourselves quite engaged. And again, some projects, of course, are like long-term, a year or more. Some are short-term, and we do quite a few talks and short workshops and initial things as well. And we do a lot of training. So we do a lot of teaching and training, and are launching a new partnership on training as well quite soon with a more commercial partner. So we try to build some longer term platforms, you can say, to do what we do.
Highly admirable what you do. It's really interesting to follow your work and see how you, as you say, build bridges between the public and the private sector in the way that you do, because you are such a hybrid, right? And I think that's very, very important in the transitions that we're looking into. When you now work on all these levels and with all these sort of projects and clients, you have a strategic target that you work with. And in that, I mean, do you work towards that we need to sort of have society within the planetary boundary? So is there some way that you have a strategic target and then you backtrack to what do we need to do today to reach that? How do you come about the necessary change?
Yeah, that's a really, really good question. For us, it's a premise that when we talk about the transition or transitioning, the kind of society we're looking at is a society where people flourish. They flourish in the workplace. They flourish in their everyday lives. It's a society where people are thriving mentally, no matter what age. It's a society, of course, that's not in conflict. It's also a society that's in balance with the planetary boundaries. It's a society that's fundamentally sustainable. For us, that's almost an implicit given, but I'm totally aware that we would, in a sense, need to maybe unpack that a little bit more because it's quite long-term, big, abstract. Everybody can maybe agree. But for us, that's a kind of a premise. And then the organizations we work with are organizations that share that overarching premise. We'll see what happens after the 2030 global goals are ending, but that's one framework that for us is important. Planetary boundaries is a framework that's important. What we, however, are saying is that what we do is not so much about the what. So how do we, I work with Vinnova, the Swedish Innovation Fund, on the future of water for Sweden. So how do you shift to a sustainable water society, really? It's called a water-wise society in Sweden by the next decade. But I'm not a water expert by any means. But what I am an expert in some way is this cross-level systemic mission-oriented work on long-term transitions. And that's exactly why I think they invited me. That's what I think they invited me to be part of their steering committee. It's certainly not because of my water expertise. So for Sune and I, we've actually made the decision to be agnostic when it comes to what is the problem. Is it health? Is it water? Is it migration, which we've worked on? Is it global development, which we've worked on? Is it future of democracy, which is hugely important? So in a way, we are saying we are about how to do it. And in many ways, that's also, of course, where strategic designers are coming from. Is like, how do we then address the goal number 17, the partnerships, the collaborations, the making the future concrete and tangible? How do we navigate ambiguity and uncertainty? How do we make abstract ideas tangible and visual and concrete and actionable? And how do we implement things so that they work for people? So all of those questions are what we work with. And so for us, it hasn't been that critical to formulate what are we working towards. But to your question, maybe we need to be a bit more sharp on that. Also because we can see, for example, that we work quite a lot with health and healthcare. For some reason, we ended up in that space quite a bit. And we, of course, also work quite a lot with welfare, whether it's education or social services or elder care, because we have that political science background that kind of lends itself to those areas. And even when it comes to private firms that we speak with, and quite a few of those are also involved with health, for example. You can imagine there are some very successful Danish companies, also some big ones that are in the healthcare space, right? So that's also where our cross-sector expertise is good, because we can then connect the dots.
It's also a matter of, the value creation in both sectors, right? And how they sort of tap into each other, because that's also a quite interesting dynamic. But I want to ask you another maybe large question, too large, is how do we get to a place where the society and all species in it and nature is thriving? Do you have some sort of ideas how to get there? Also economically, do we have to change our economic system, the way we value, let's say, progress, for instance?
No, for sure. In our book Expand that I published a couple of years ago with Jens Martin Skibsted, we make a pretty big argument both for reimagining value and expanding how we think about what's valuable. And that also goes for designers who've actually, in many ways, designers have gone hand in hand with capitalist and consumption society for 100 years or more. So how do we reimagine what is valuable beyond economic growth and revenue and profits to many, many other types of value, including, of course, social and green value, but could also be value like trust and transparency and participation and engagement and democracy and so on. So there's value. And I think when you ask about the relationship between people and planet or other species, then I think leveling the field and seeing ourselves as one species amongst others rather than sitting above all other living things is part of the mindset and the positioning and the question we need to ask there. And that in itself opens up for new value. My professorship with UTS in Sydney is super interesting because it's the TD school. It's a transdisciplinary design school of the university, which sits across all 26 institutes at the university. So it's like this transdisciplinary faculty, really. And some of my colleagues, the researchers, academics there, are exploring how to exactly reconnect humans with species, also in the wild. For example, in Australia, in the bush, but also in other countries, also in Europe. And so that's super interesting to me to be exposed to that kind of quite radical perspective where we are repositioning and even also looking at of course, the rights and the diversity and needs of other species, right? So I think that's for sure on the value side. And I think you had two questions in there, didn't you? Because one was value and what was the other one?
I think it was about how to get there, right?
Yeah. And the how to get there again is like the big question. I think our experience, both from Mindlab and from the Danish Design Centre, is that there's an underinvestment in the how. There are CEOs, and when we work quite often with senior management and CEOs, that they do understand where they need to go. That they often have a vision and often have some want to leave a legacy, some want to spend their time in a position of power to really transform things, but they really don't know how. Because that's not something that the organizations have trained, and for good reason. And it's also a question of deeper and more systemic transition, which does address, as you also said, Emilia, do we need to reimagine our economic system? Do we need to reimagine how we think about welfare and public services? Do we need to reimagine what good looks like when it comes to our digital world? I worked on one project on reimagining migration, and I can tell you that was set back a little bit by the election of the new US president. But we do have to reimagine migration. every smart scholar you meet in that space will say people want to move. People in Africa they're the youngest generation in the world, or the youngest continent in the world. They want to move. They want to have a good life. They want to have jobs. They want to contribute. And Europe is aging. Denmark is aging. The Western society is aging. China is aging. Japan is certainly aging. South Korea is aging. So how do we come to terms with that people want to move and should be allowed to move? Just like we want to move. I mean, I want to have the chance to move and work in Tanzania. Why should somebody from Tanzania not be able to move and work here in Denmark? Humans have always done it. So how do we push the boundaries of how we can imagine these systems? And migration is a very contested one and very political, but that goes for many, many other ones. So the notion of reimagining, whether it's reimagining institutions, reimagining policies, reimagining systems, and I think that's where we really need to do some really hard work. And that's what Sune and I love to do.
Since you also have so much experience from also other places than Denmark, do you feel that people and organizations share the same future values also regarding to Goal 17? Do we need to come more back together? Is there like some friction on how we see the future?
Yeah.
In your view?
I mean, I think we have to have a lot of humility for super diverse sort of cultures and national traditions and so on. And when I worked with the United Nations Development Program, for example, on sort of globally looking at how they work with innovation and systemic change, for sure, there's huge cultural differences, and also just, societal context can be massively different. I mean, are you trying to create change in Iraq, or are you trying to create change in Peru or in the United States or in Denmark? But I think that overarching, and there's some great books out there on the sort of the long-term trajectory of humankind and of how we, first of all, foremost, that we are fundamentally, and I believe that strongly, we are born as a race to be mostly kind and mostly good. And we sometimes forget that when we design organizations and collaborations, but that's a big part of the place we are coming from. We also forget that people, in many ways, when you put long-term futures up and you begin to discuss what good looks like, then we share many of the same dreams around living sustainably, living in peace, thriving, having opportunities, having freedom. Humans even see beauty the same way across all cultures and nationalities when it comes to the fundamental aspects of aesthetics and beauty. So I think there's a lot that can be done across, you could say, globally. Now, what I think is so important to realize and mention, and maybe this is important in this call as well, or this podcast, is that we are so incredibly privileged here in the Nordics, both to live at this time, but to live in this geography. And I think we have a massive obligation to contribute also beyond our own borders and to also share what we've learned. Because what the Nordics have done, and there are some great books, including one called The Nordic Secret, is that we have somehow pulled ourselves out of being incredibly poor and irrelevant in Europe and the world to being highlighted as the place on the planet where democracy still flourishes while it's actually being diminished everywhere else. We're being highlighted as the most competitive, and this goes maybe old school economy, right? But the most competitive part in the planet. I just met a economics professor yesterday, basically on the street, but somebody I know, and he said, by the way, Christian, we have to remember that Denmark is the only European country that has a productivity, and this is a classic, economic term, a productivity as high as the United States has. We're also a place where we created a welfare state where we are able to be so productive at the same time as paying the highest taxes on the planet. Oh, and by the way, we are the happiest, more or less, people. I think, unfortunately, I'm afraid, Isaac, that Finland kind of tops the list, but Denmark is pretty close. And we have the highest trust on the planet. We have the lowest power distance in organizations on the planet. We also have some of the most competent governments, which, of course, is a big reason why we are where we are. We also have unions and tripartite agreements that create stability in the labor market and give people power and influence over their own jobs. There's a reason why human-centered design and participatory design started in Scandinavia, right? Scandinavian tradition and participatory design. Why? Because labor unions were concerned that their members, that workers should take control over their own lives when it comes to new technology. So you want to design technology with the users, which are workers. So there's this massive, massive Nordic DNA that we never really reflect on here because we live in it. It's like fish don't understand that they don't know they're swimming in water until they're told, right? And don't understand we're swimming in this quite incredible, remarkable place that the rest of the world in many ways envy us, but also don't understand. And how do we leverage that and share that? And that's one reason why we we are planning to launch a new training course, national training course in Denmark on Nordic leadership, or maybe new Nordic leadership, which of course comes on the back of everything else new Nordic. But we need to share this with each other and reflect on it and be better at it, but also with the rest of the world.
That's a super interesting point because I talked to also a graduate strategic designer that I co-hosted a design sprint with a few weeks ago. And he said that we should actually also celebrate that we're here in Copenhagen together because the master program combines people from various nationalities as well. But he said that we should actually celebrate that we're in Copenhagen because that's also, as you just mentioned, all these elements super unique. And we tend to, as Danes, to overlook it. But when we then meet internationals from like everywhere in the world, because the strategic design program it is really a hub for people across the globe.
It is, and actually, this the other day, I was giving some sparring to a student at UTS Sydney. Unfortunately, only online, but it turned out she had spent a semester in Copenhagen at the course or the masters in strategic design entrepreneurship, and she said something interesting because I mean, Australia. Not only is it also quite a well-functioning society and a democracy and so on, it's also pretty relaxed. I mean, when you think Australia, you think about beaches and barbecuing, right? But she said that it was massively more relaxed and human to be a student in Copenhagen than it is in Australia because of the way teachers relate to students. And that's, of course, because, as we all know, that people are informal, that they are first name, that they respect students for being adults with value and not just as a product of a university or something. And this is not to diminish my own university, UTS, but that there is in the Anglo-Saxon world, and certainly if you move to the Germanic world and to the many parts of Asia, a much, much more hierarchical, much, much more sort of distance between, for example, a teacher and a student. And that's something that we in Scandinavia don't have, and we take for granted that we can have that kind of relationship. And I'm not saying that sometimes maybe a little bit distance can be all right, but fundamentally we have this egalitarian society, and there's a reason why that also means, for example, that we are societies where we have high trust and where we also can feel safe, and where we have very little, relatively speaking, I know, but less polarization, right? Because we can speak with each other, we can trust each other, and we don't have the same class divisions to the same degree as many, many other countries have.
Yeah, exactly. And now I'm also a part-time program assistant at the Academy for the program. And I also see Camilla, and big shout out to her, the head of program. She's extremely good at helping everyone because everyone who applies for this specific program has a certain desire to change. They have all worked previously in their field as an architect or designer or whatever their background is. And then they want to change certain elements of that, and then they apply for the master program in strategic design. And she's so good at fostering this development of them as a professional person and to see where they can sort of fit into a system and help them doing that. So I would say that also adds to that strategic design it is a very unique position that you either work or you either develop working in the field or that you can educate yourself as we have done, but then you also have to really form that role afterwards, right?
You do, but I think you're also successful in doing it, aren't you? Because the labor market participation of graduates from this master's, as far as I remember, is quite high, and people get jobs,
yeah,
which you can't say for all design educations.
That's very true. Very true. What role do you think strategic designers play in this evolving landscape and in these geopolitical tensions and with the transition that we're looking into? What role does a strategic designer play in that?
Well, I think both strategic design as a field, as a professional field in itself that informs other fields, cutting across business, political science, plays a very significant role. And I see that because working with, for example, international organizations that are working on some of the biggest and most urgent challenges, they are embedding strategic design. They're doing it in the World Health Organization, they're doing it in UNDP, they're doing it in UNICEF, they're doing it in all of those large organizations, and they equally are doing it within large corporates, for example. So we see that there's this embedding in different forms and formats, of course. And we see that strategic designers are picking up those roles. And again, a strategic designer is not a protected title, so people can have quite different backgrounds. But in a sense, strategic, when you add the word strategic to design, it's in a way to say that you are maybe even more focused on the value creation and the impact of an organization, and at a maybe more long-term and more wide level than if you are, you could say, a product designer or a service designer, and you are working more on a discrete individual services or product, right? And so given that what we're looking at is not more business as usual, and it's not just churning out more products because the world actually doesn't need more products, it needs new systems for circularity, for example. Or it's not just churning out more services because people don't need just to be delighted, they need to be perhaps educated and helped in shifting behavior towards more sustainable behaviors. Well, then the emphasis needs to be on strategic design, because those are the ones that work on the cross-cutting, long-term, cross-level systemic issues. And so I see an extremely bright future for strategic designers, and I truly hope that not only you both will be really successful in whatever you choose to do. And again, also remember to maybe redefine success. In the old days, it might have been a lot of money and a fine title and a corner office. And today, probably success looks very, very different. And it should look different, because we don't need more of that kind of success. We need successes that are shifting behaviors, shifting our different systems towards a more sustainable place. And that's where strategic designers should play a role.
Skill sets do you think it's important in that for a strategic designer? You mentioned earlier about having a high social IQ, because I think that's also quite important, that you really do have this like social awareness when you're a strategic designer. But what skills do you think are the most important?
Yes, if you go beyond the purely professional skills, which we, at least in this podcast, know what are, then, I mean, it's not just about being likable, it's having that, as you said as well, or repeated as well, like the high social IQ, right? The ability to read other people, to read what motivates people, what interests them, understand, empathize with, and not just people actually, but also empathize with organizations. When we talk about mobilizing for systemic change, it's about mobilizing people, yes, but it's also about mobilizing organizations across multiple sectors and understanding what is needed for organizations to think beyond themselves. And that's always really, really hard, because organizations are built to think about themselves and do whatever they do. And now we have to actually do it across. That's why, back to goal number 17. I think, unfortunately, there's probably also a skill about patience, having a patience, because change doesn't come as fast as we think. I keep being, again, when you grow older, you realize you have the benefit of looking back, and you see how long things actually did take. As an example, I mean, we did a project in Mindlab of involving youth and reimagining services, taxation services online for young people in Denmark. And I remember finishing the project and then thinking, I wonder when this will actually, be implemented, or somebody realizes it's actually changed something. And then, 4 years later, there's a new website done by the tax authority. It's still running now. It's 10 years later. But so young people actually do meet a different interface when they interact with tax. It was 4 years. And I'm not saying that you have to see everything through, because sometimes it's other people doing the implementation, but having that kind of patience. And when we talk about sustainable transitions, then it's not 4 years, it's maybe 10 years, or maybe it's 40 years. So I think that's another trait. And then, of course, there's a trait of, really, you might call that leadership, or you might call it something else, but it's a stewardship. But it's basically, how do you allow and help others invoke their imagination, and how do you help others come to their own conclusions about what is needed, right? So we can't preach and induce things as much as we have to facilitate things. And of course, that's also part of the profession of strategic designers. So something around the listening and the empathizing and the understanding of the human dynamics and organizational dynamics. And then there's something about patience and something about the stewardship, which are certainly important.
And now, also looking forward with the Transition Collective, are there any bigger projects or problems that you are excited about to solve? Can you a little bit share about what will happen in the coming months or years?
Yeah, I think one bigger one we are working on is the question of scaling innovations, right? So one is that we know how to innovate small scale, how do we go big scale? And so we work on a project that I can't tell the details, but which is really about, in scaling health solutions across entire countries, and what does it really take for governments to do that? I think the role of government actors in enabling that innovations go from small to big is just super critical. And it's also important that it's led by government and not necessarily by market forces. So it becomes the commercial interests that drive what reaches patients and communities, but it really becomes the community-based solutions, or government, at least responsible solutions, that are scaled. Another one we're working on is in different ways is innovation leadership and the cultures it takes to lead innovation in very complex organizations. So back to this question of how do we infuse and enact organizational change. And then finally, I mentioned it before, and again, we'll announce it quite soon, but we are launching a quite massive partnership around future skills and training in systems change, leadership, missions, and the skills it takes to really drive long-term transitions, both for leaders but also for practitioners. Where one of the courses, which will be a first, I think, in the Danish situation, is one on imagination, collective imagination and foresight, and not in the traditional sort of scenario way, but more in sort of how to invoke new pictures of a better future, which I think is sorely needed in organizations. So all of those things and more is to come, but that partnership is something we expect a lot from, because we want to reach. We're a small team maybe, but we want to reach more people, and we of course will do that naturally in partnership with others.
Christian, do you have a great advice for someone just starting in the field, or maybe an advice that you have received yourself that lives in you still to this day?
Yeah. I mean, I've benefited, as I said before, from my very first sort of experience in the labor market as a young person in Ramble, where I realized how far you can go from trust and being trusted, and creating space and freedom for people to do their best they can. So, of course, when you're quite young in the labor market, then you go into organizations and sort of have to take what's there. But I think pretty quickly you can influence things, and no matter where you stand in a job market or in an organization, you can influence things. And so what you do in terms of insisting on human kindness, on positive relations, on trusting others and expecting to be trusted, and the more you can also, and this is, I think, an advice, is that no matter where you are, you can make it better. I think the fundamental ethos in design, which I love so much, which is, by the way, not a fundamental ethos in political science, but in design, there is always that drive to make things better. And better does not necessarily mean sell more or cost more, but it's a future-oriented stance that is ambitious about changing things for the better. And today, it's not just for the better for people, it's also better for other living beings. But that is something never to forget, because that's really what will drive the impact and value you can create in the world as a strategic designer.
Definitely. Do you have some books? You can also recommend your own, or podcasts that you would like to recommend to our listeners.
Yeah, I mean, I did, of course, publish the book Expand with Jens Martin Skibsted. It's called Expand, Stretching the Future by Design. And I need to recommend that because not only because Jens Martin and I want to sell books, but mostly because it does address many of the things we discussed today. And it actually has the provocation that we need to bring more thinking into design thinking, or bring more reflection and thinking and values into design as such. And I know that you're doing that, and it's happening in strategic design, but in many places it's not enough. So that's the big point one big point in Expand. And it also does address the question of the Nordics as a particularly relevant place to understand the future of design, perhaps. So that's one recommendation. And I actually also did a podcast on that book that I might send you. There's a wonderful person, Nadim Kushar, who runs this podcast called Curiosity That Matters. And I think it's a nice name, for almost as nice as your name. I can maybe share that one as well. So that's a couple of recommendations. And then I think actually one book that brings design and political science together is a wonderful book called The Ministry for the Future by Kim Stanley Robinson. That's highly recommended. Not so new, but it's still extremely relevant.
Fantastic. And where can our listeners follow your work online?
They can follow certainly on LinkedIn. I posted even something this morning on a thing I'm doing on relational welfare. Then, of course, check out transitioncollective.org.
Great. Thank you so much for joining us today, Christian.
Yeah, thank you, Christian.
Really a pleasure. Thanks so much for having me.
It was a huge pleasure. And thank you to everyone listening to this episode of Unfolding Strategic Design. And remember to do what Christian said. Keep listening, be empathetic, and be a great steward for others. Thank you. If you enjoyed today's episode of Unfolding Strategic Design, make sure to follow us on LinkedIn, Spotify, and Apple Podcast. Your support helps us bring in more inspiring voices from the world of strategic design.